Captain David Rodriguez never thought aliens would be real. 3 years ago, he was just another soldier fighting in the Earth Defense Force, protecting colonies from space pirates, and dealing with the usual human conflicts. Then, everything changed. In one day, when massive ships appeared in the sky above every major Earth city, the ships didn't attack. Instead, they sent a message that shocked everyone on the planet. There was something out there in space that was much worse than anything humans had ever faced. Something that destroyed entire worlds and ate everything in its path. The aliens called it the Void Swarm, and it was heading toward both Earth and their home world. David remembered watching the news broadcasts with his fellow soldiers. Everyone was scared, confused, and angry all at the same time. Some people wanted to fight, the aliens. Others wanted to hide, but the government made a deal. Earth would work together with these aliens called the Zephyrians to fight against this terrible enemy that threatened them both. That's how David found himself on a shuttle flying toward the biggest spaceship he had ever seen. The Zephyrian command vessel looked like a crystal palace floating in space. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. As his shuttle got closer, David could see other human shuttles docking with the alien ship. He wasn't the only one being sent to work with these strange new allies. The inside of the alien ship was unlike anything David had ever imagined. The walls seemed to glow with their own light, and everything looked like it was carved from precious stones. The corridors were huge, built for beings much taller than humans. David felt small walking through them, his military boots echoing strangely in the vast spaces. He had been chosen for this mission because of his record. In 3 years of service, David had led successful missions that saved thousands of lives. He had fought space pirates, rescued hostages, and defended colonies that seemed impossible to protect. His superiors said he was one of their best tactical minds. He could think fast under pressure and come up with solutions when everything seemed hopeless. But nothing had prepared him for meeting Princess Astra. The meeting room was enormous, with a ceiling so high that David couldn't see the top. Alien officers stood in perfect formation around the edges of the room. They were all tall, with skin that seemed to shimmer between blue and silver depending on how the light hit it. Their eyes were large and completely black, and they moved, with a grace that made David feel clumsy just watching them. At the center of the room stood the princess. She was even taller than the others, maybe 7 feet, and she wore what looked like armor made of living light. Her hair floated around, her head like she was underwater, and when she spoke, her voice sounded like music mixed with the rumble of thunder. "So," she said, looking down at David like he was something interesting she had found on the bottom of her shoe. "This is what humanity sends as their finest warrior." David stood at attention, the way he had been trained. He kept his face blank and professional, even though something about her tone made his stomach tighten. He had dealt with difficult commanders before. This couldn't be much different. Princess Astra walked around him in a slow circle, like she was examining a piece of equipment she might want to buy. Her alien officers watched silently, their black eyes reflecting David's image back at him. "Tell me, Captain Rodriguez," she continued, "what exactly do you humans think you can contribute to a real war? Your technology is primitive, your ships are slow and ugly, your weapons are crude. What makes you believe you have anything to offer beings who have been fighting among the stars for thousands of years?" David felt heat rise in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. "Ma'am, humans have survived and thrived through adaptation and determination. We've learned to fight smart when we can't fight with superior technology. Our record speaks for itself." The princess laughed, and the sound was like crystal bells mixed with winter wind. It wasn't a happy sound. "How charming," she said to her officers, speaking as if David wasn't standing right there. "They think their little skirmishes with space pirates qualify as real combat experience. It's almost adorable. One of the alien officers made a sound that might have been agreement. David realized they were all looking at him with what seemed like amusement, like he was a child who had just claimed he could fly to the moon. "Captain," Princess Astra said, turning back to him, "let me explain something to you. The Zephyrian Empire has conquered star systems while your species was still learning to make fire. We have weapons that can destroy planets and shields that can stop the power of suns. We have strategies and tactics that have been refined over millennia of warfare across the galaxy." She leaned down closer to David, and he could smell something like ozone and flowers. "What you call warfare, we call children playing with toys. What you call tactics, we call barely controlled chaos. You are here because our leaders believe in being diplomatic, but do not mistake our politeness for respect." David looked around the room at all the alien faces watching him. Some seemed curious, others looked bored. None of them looked like they thought he belonged there. He had felt out of place before in his military career, but never like this, never like he was a different species entirely. "I understand, Your Highness," David said carefully. "I'm here to learn and to represent humanity as best I can." "Yes," Princess Astra said, straightening up to her full height. "You are here to observe real warriors at work. Try not to get in the way." The meeting continued for another hour, with the princess explaining how human forces would be integrated into Zephyrian battle plans. David listened to her describe tactics that sounded impressive, but seemed to rely entirely on having better technology than the enemy. When he tried to ask questions about what would happen if they faced an enemy that could adapt quickly, she dismissed his concerns with a wave of her hand. "Adaptation is what primitive species do when they lack proper planning," she said. "Superior beings create plans that work regardless of what the enemy does." After the meeting, David found himself assigned quarters in a section of the ship designated for allied species. The rooms were smaller than the ones designed for Zephyrians, but they were still more luxurious than anything David had experienced in his military career. The walls showed views of space that changed slowly, like looking through a window that could see in any direction. But David couldn't enjoy the luxury. He sat on the edge of the alien bed, still wearing his uniform, thinking about the princess's words. He had spent years proving himself to fellow humans who sometimes doubted him because of his background or his unconventional ideas. But he had always known that if he worked hard enough and fought bravely enough, he could earn their respect. This felt different. This felt like no matter what he did, no matter how many battles he won or lives he saved, Princess Astra would never see him as anything more than a barely civilized animal that happened to be useful. David walked to the wall that showed the view of space. Somewhere out there was Earth, the planet he had sworn to protect. Somewhere else out there was the Void Swarm, the enemy that threatened everything he cared about. And here he was, surrounded by allies who treated him like he was already defeated. For the first time in his military career, Captain David Rodriguez wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. David decided he wasn't going to let Princess Astra's words break him down. He had faced worse situations before, and he had always found a way to prove himself through action. If she thought humans were primitive and useless, he would show her exactly what a human soldier could do. The first chance came during training exercises 3 days later. The Zephyrians had set up a massive simulation room that could create any kind of battlefield they wanted. It looked real enough to fool anyone, complete with fake enemies, explosions, and even simulated pain when you got hit. David watched as Zephyrian soldiers moved through the exercise with perfect coordination. They advanced in beautiful formations, their weapons firing in synchronized patterns that looked like a deadly dance. Everything they did was precise, calculated, and flawless. It was impressive, but David noticed something that bothered him. They always did the same thing. Every time they encountered an enemy position, they used the same strategy: form up, advance in a specific pattern, Overwhelm with superior firepower, move to the next target. It worked perfectly against the computer enemies in the simulation, but David had learned in real combat that enemies don't always behave the way you expect them to. When it was his turn to run the exercise, David did something different. Instead of following the standard approach, he studied the battlefield for several minutes first. He noticed places where he could move without being seen, weak points in the enemy defenses, and opportunities to attack from unexpected angles. Zephyrian officers watching him seemed confused by his hesitation. Princess Astra was there too, standing with her arms crossed, and that same look on her face that said she was watching something mildly entertaining, but ultimately pointless. Then, David moved. But instead of charging straight at the enemy like the Zephyrians had done, he disappeared into the shadows. He used the terrain to hide his approach, crawled through areas that the computer enemies weren't watching, and struck from behind when they least expected it. The simulation ended in half the time it had taken the Zephyrian soldiers, with David completing the objective while taking almost no damage. The room fell silent as the fake battlefield faded away, leaving everyone standing in an empty white space. "Interesting," Princess Astra said, but her tone suggested it was anything but. "You chose to hide and sneak rather than face your enemies, with honor. How very human." David felt his jaw tighten. "With respect, Your Highness, the objective was to win, not to look good doing it. In real combat, a dead hero can't protect anyone." One of the Zephyrian officers stepped forward. "The captain has a point, Princess. His approach was highly effective." Princess Astra's expression grew colder. "Effectiveness without honor is merely survival instinct. Any animal can hide in the shadows and strike when the predator isn't looking. We Zephyrians have evolved beyond such crude methods." Over the following weeks, David threw himself into every training exercise and strategic session he could find. He studied Zephyrian tactics until he understood them completely, then found ways to improve them using human methods. When they practiced ship-to-ship combat, David suggested maneuvers that could confuse enemy targeting systems. When they ran ground assault simulations, he showed them how to use terrain in ways their textbooks had never considered. Every time, his ideas worked. Every time, they achieved better results than the standard Zephyrian approaches. And every time, Princess Astra found a way to dismiss his contributions. Brute force compensation, she called it, when David's tactics won a particularly difficult simulation. Your species' natural tendency toward violence has clouded your strategic thinking. David started to notice that other humans on the ship were watching these interactions. Some of them looked embarrassed when the princess spoke to David like he was a child. Others seemed angry on his behalf, but none of them said anything. They were all in the same position he was, trying to prove that humanity deserved to be part of this alliance. The breaking point came during a major strategy meeting. 2 weeks later, intelligence reports had come in about void swarm movements near a human colony world called New Haven. The colony had 50,000 people, mostly families who had moved there to start new lives away from the crowded cities of Earth. David studied the tactical situation for hours before the meeting. New Haven was in a difficult position, surrounded by asteroid fields that would make it hard for large ships to approach directly. The Zephyrian plan called for a frontal assault with their most powerful vessels, blasting through the asteroids and overwhelming the void swarm with superior firepower. It was exactly the kind of direct approach that David had seen the Zephyrians use in every simulation. It would probably work, but it would also be costly. A lot of ships would be damaged or destroyed fighting their way through those asteroid fields. David had a different idea. The asteroid fields that made it hard for big ships to get through were perfect for smaller, more maneuverable vessels. Human fighters could slip through spaces that Zephyrian battleships couldn't even see. They could hit the void swarm from angles that the enemy wouldn't expect, disrupting their formations and creating openings for the main fleet. When his turn came to speak at the meeting, David stood up and activated the holographic display. He had spent the entire previous night preparing his presentation, making sure every detail was perfect. "Your Highness, fellow officers," he began, "I believe we can save New Haven with minimal losses if we modify our approach slightly." He showed his plan step by step. Small human fighters would enter the asteroid field first, using their size and agility to avoid detection. They would position themselves at key points around the Void Swarm fleet. When the main Zephyrian force arrived and began their assault, the human fighters would attack simultaneously from multiple directions, creating chaos in the enemy ranks. This flanking maneuver would allow us to defeat the Void Swarm while preserving our larger vessels, David explained. "We estimate it could save hundreds of lives and dozens of ships." For a moment, the room was quiet. David could see several Zephyrian officers nodding thoughtfully. Even some of the humans looked impressed. He thought maybe, finally, he had found a way to make Princess Astra see that human tactics had value. Then she started laughing. It wasn't the musical laugh he had heard before. This was harsh, mocking, designed to cut. Every head in the room turned toward her as she stood up, her tall frame towering over everyone else. "Captain Rodriguez," she said, and her voice carried that particular tone people use when they're talking, "to someone they think is very, very stupid. Your species' tendency toward violence and chaos has clearly clouded your judgment beyond repair." David felt his heart sink, but she wasn't finished. "We Zephyrians have evolved beyond such primitive methodologies. We don't skulk in shadows like frightened animals. We don't rely on tricks and deception like common pirates. We face our enemies with honor, using superior strategy and overwhelming force." She gestured dismissively at his holographic display. "Your little plan might work for the crude skirmishes that humans call warfare, but this is a real battle against a real enemy. Perhaps you should leave the strategic thinking to those of us who are actually capable of it." The silence that followed was deafening. David looked around the room and saw the faces of his fellow humans. Some looked embarrassed, others seemed angry. A few couldn't even meet his eyes. The Zephyrian officers who had been nodding at his plan now stared straight ahead, their expressions carefully neutral. David stood there for a long moment, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. He had put everything into that plan. He had worked harder on it than anything else in his military career. And she had destroyed it with a few casual words. Not because it was wrong, but because it came from a human. "I understand, Your Highness," David said quietly. His voice sounded strange in his own ears, like it was coming from very far away. That night, David sat in his quarters, staring at the wall that showed the view of space. Somewhere out there, 50,000 people on New Haven were counting on this alliance to save them. They had no idea that their fate was being decided by beings who saw humans as barely evolved animals. For the first time since joining the military, David began to wonder if there was a point to any of this. He had spent his entire adult life trying to prove himself, trying to earn respect through dedication and skill. But what happened when respect was impossible to earn? What happened when no matter what you did, no matter how good you were, someone would always see you as less than they were? David opened his personal computer and began typing. He wasn't sure what he was writing at first, but gradually the words became clear. He was writing his resignation from the liaison program. More than that, he was writing his resignation from military service entirely. As he typed, David realized something that surprised him. For the first time in weeks, he felt peaceful. The constant pressure to prove himself, to earn respect that would never come, was lifting from his shoulders like a heavy weight he hadn't realized he was carrying. Maybe it was time to try something different. Maybe it was time to walk away. David spent 3 sleepless nights staring at his resignation letter on the computer screen. The words looked strange to him, like they belonged to someone else. Captain David Rodriguez, requesting immediate transfer back to Earth and discharge from active military service. After reading it for the 100th time, he finally pressed the send button. The response came faster than he expected. Within an hour, his commanding officer, Colonel Harrison, was calling him for a private meeting. The colonel was a tough man who had fought in more battles than David could count. But when David walked into his temporary office on the Zephyrian ship, Harrison looked worried. "Son, what the hell is going on?" Harrison asked, gesturing for David to sit down. "Your resignation request just landed on my desk like a bomb. You're one of our best officers. We need you here." David had prepared for this conversation, but actually having it was harder than he thought. "Sir, I don't think I'm the right person for this assignment anymore." "Because of the princess?" Harrison leaned back in his chair. "Look, I know she's difficult. I've heard the reports. But we can't let personal conflicts interfere with the mission." "With respect, sir, this isn't about personal conflict," David said. "It's about effectiveness. I can't do my job if every suggestion I make is dismissed before it's even considered. The Zephyrians don't want human input. They want human compliance." Harrison was quiet for a long moment. "The Alliance needs human representation, David. If you leave, what message does that send?" "Maybe it sends the message that respect has to go both ways," David replied. The colonel tried for another hour to change David's mind. He talked about duty, about the bigger picture, about the thousands of lives that depended on the Alliance working. David listened to every word, and part of him wanted to take it all back, to stay and keep fighting for respect that might never come. But a bigger part of him was tired. Tired of proving himself over and over again. Tired of being treated like a child. Tired of watching his ideas work perfectly in practice while being dismissed as primitive in theory. Word of David's resignation spread through the human sections of the ship like wildfire. Other human officers came to his quarters to talk him out of it. Some of them were angry, saying he was abandoning the team when they needed unity most. Others understood but begged him to reconsider for the sake of morale. The Zephyrian response was more interesting. Several alien officers who had worked with David during training exercises approached him privately. They spoke in careful, respectful tones that he had never heard them use before. "Captain Rodriguez," one of them said, "your tactical innovations were illuminating. Perhaps there has been some misunderstanding about human capabilities." David appreciated their words, but it was too little, too late. If Princess Astra had treated him with even basic professional courtesy, these officers might have spoken up weeks ago. Their silence during his public humiliation told him everything. He needed to know about where their loyalties lay. On the morning of his scheduled departure, David made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of quietly leaving the ship, he was going to make a statement. Not out of anger or revenge, but because someone needed to say what everyone was thinking, but nobody wanted to voice. The main command center was busy that morning, with both human and Zephyrian officers preparing for the next phase of operations. David walked in wearing his full dress uniform, every piece of armor polished to a mirror shine. Conversations gradually stopped as people noticed him entering the room. Princess Astra was there, standing at the central holographic display with her usual group of advisors. She glanced at David with mild interest, probably wondering why he was interrupting important work. David walked to the center of the room, where everyone could see him clearly. The command center fell completely silent. Even the soft humming of the ship's systems seemed to quiet down. "Your Highness," David said, his voice calm and clear. "Fellow officers, I want to thank you for the opportunity to serve alongside the Zephyrian fleet." Princess Astra looked confused. This wasn't how resignations usually went. People didn't make speeches. They just left quietly. David reached up and began unfastening his helmet. The sound of the clasps releasing echoed in the silent room. "This helmet," he said, holding it up for everyone to see, "represents 3 years of service to the Earth Defense Force. 3 years of learning, fighting, and protecting people who couldn't protect themselves." He set the helmet down on the floor with a soft clink that seemed incredibly loud in the silence. Next came his chest armor. Each piece had been custom-fitted after David earned his rank. The armor bore scuff marks from battles, scratches that told stories of close calls and desperate fights. "This armor has seen 17 major engagements," David continued, his voice never wavering. "It's protected me while I led missions to save colonies, rescue hostages, and defend shipping lanes from pirates." Piece by piece, the armor came off. The arm guards that had deflected enemy fire during the siege of Titan Station, the leg plates that had carried him through the toxic swamps of Kepler 442b during the refugee evacuation. Each piece represented not just protection, but memories, experiences, and proof of his capabilities. Princess Astra watched with growing confusion and what might have been concern. This wasn't the behavior of a disgruntled soldier. This was something else entirely. "I've spent my entire adult life fighting for something greater than myself," David said, as he removed the final piece of armor, leaving him standing in his basic uniform. "I've bled for strangers, sacrificed for causes, and followed orders even when they led me into situations that seemed impossible." He looked directly at Princess Astra for the first time since entering the room. His eyes were calm, not angry or hurt, just infinitely tired. "But I won't spend another day being treated as less than I am by someone who mistakes cruelty for superiority," he said quietly. "I won't pretend that disrespect is diplomacy or that insults are strategy." The princess opened her mouth to respond, but David wasn't finished. "I hope your advanced civilization finds a way to defeat the Void Swarm," he continued. "I hope you save both our worlds from destruction. I truly do. But you'll do it without me." David turned to address the entire room. "To my fellow humans, I'm sorry if this disappoints you, but sometimes the most important battle you can fight is the one for your own dignity. Sometimes walking away is the only way to show people what they're really losing." He looked back at Princess Astra one final time. "Your Highness, I wish you wisdom in your future endeavors. Perhaps someday you'll understand that true strength doesn't come from making others feel small." David walked toward the exit, leaving his armor scattered on the floor like a shed skin. Every step felt lighter than the last. Behind him, the command center remained completely silent. Even Princess Astra, who always had something to say, stood, speechless. As David reached the door, he heard someone begin to speak behind him, but he didn't turn around. He had said everything he needed to say. For the first time in months, he felt like himself again. The shuttle that would take him back to Earth was waiting in the docking bay. As David walked toward it, he realized that he wasn't leaving in defeat. He was leaving with his dignity intact, and that made all the difference in the world. 2 weeks after David left, the Alliance faced its first real test against the Void Swarm. Princess Astra stood in the command center of her flagship, watching as dozens of enemy vessels emerged from hyperspace near the colony world of New Haven. This was exactly the scenario David had tried to prepare for during that strategy meeting, but his plan had been dismissed as primitive thinking. Now, 50,000 innocent people were counting on Zephyrian tactics to save them. "Begin the assault," Princess Astra commanded, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had never doubted her own superiority. "Execute Battle Plan Omega-7." The Zephyrian fleet moved into formation with the precision of a perfectly choreographed dance. Massive battleships took the lead, their energy shields shimmering like soap bubbles around hulls that gleamed like polished silver. Behind them came the cruisers and destroyers, each ship taking its assigned position in the grand formation that had been perfected over centuries of warfare. It was beautiful to watch. Every ship knew exactly where to go and what to do. The formation was mathematically perfect, designed to maximize firepower while minimizing exposure to enemy attacks. According to every tactical manual in the Zephyrian military, this approach had never failed against any enemy they had encountered. But the Void Swarm wasn't like any enemy the Zephyrians had faced before. The alien bioships looked like massive insects crossed with sea creatures, their dark surfaces pulsing with veins of sickly green light. They moved in patterns that seemed random at first, darting and weaving through space in ways that no logical mind would expect. But as the battle began, Princess Astra realized there was intelligence behind the chaos. The Void Swarm ships weren't just moving randomly. They were adapting. When the Zephyrian fleet opened fire with their primary weapons, the enemy ships immediately began changing their formation. Instead of maintaining predictable flight paths, they started moving in spirals and loops that made them nearly impossible to target effectively. When the Zephyrians adjusted their firing patterns to compensate, the Void Swarm adapted again, this time splitting into smaller groups that attacked from multiple directions. "Maintain formation," Princess Astra ordered, but she could hear uncertainty creeping into her own voice. "Continue with Battle Plan Omega-7. The Zephyrian formation was designed to work as a single unit. Each ship depended on the others to cover its weak points while maximizing the overall firepower of the fleet. But the Void Swarm seemed to understand this better than the Zephyrians did themselves. The enemy ships began targeting the connections between Zephyrian vessels, attacking the exact points where the formation was most vulnerable. Within minutes, the perfect formation began to fall apart. Ships found themselves isolated, cut off from their support vessels by swarms of enemy fighters that seemed to appear from nowhere. The mathematical precision that had always been the Zephyrians' greatest strength became their weakness as the Void Swarm exploited every predictable element of their tactics. Princess Astra watched in growing horror as her fleet struggled against an enemy that refused to fight the way enemies were supposed to fight. The Void Swarm ships moved like they were alive, responding to threats faster than any computer system should have been able to process. When Zephyrian ships tried to retreat and regroup, the enemy anticipated their movements and cut off their escape routes. "Princess!" one of her tactical officers called out, his usual calm professionalism cracking under pressure. "We're losing cohesion. The enemy is disrupting our formation faster than we can compensate." "Then we adapt our formation," Princess Astra replied, but even as she said it, she knew it wouldn't work. Zephyrian tactics were based on centuries of refinement and mathematical precision. You couldn't just change them in the middle of a battle without months of preparation and training. As she watched her ships struggle, Princess Astra found herself thinking about something she had tried very hard to forget: David's plan. The flanking maneuver he had proposed using small, fast human fighters to attack from unexpected angles. At the time, she had dismissed it as the desperate thinking of a primitive species. Now, watching the Void Swarm use exactly that kind of unpredictable, chaotic strategy to tear apart her fleet, she began to understand what David had been trying to tell her. The battle lasted 3 hours. By the end, the Zephyrian fleet had been forced to retreat, leaving New Haven defenseless. 12 ships had been destroyed completely, with dozens more badly damaged. Worse than the material losses were the casualties. Thousands of trained Zephyrian officers and crew members were dead, floating in space among the wreckage of vessels that were supposed to be invincible. The Void Swarm ships moved on toward New Haven itself, and there was nothing Princess Astra could do to stop them. In the aftermath of the defeat, the command ship felt like a tomb. Officers moved through the corridors in stunned silence, unable to believe that their perfect tactics had failed so completely. Princess Astra sat alone in her private chambers, staring at the tactical reports that told the story of her first major defeat. The worst part wasn't the ships they had lost or even the lives that had been sacrificed. The worst part was knowing that it could have been prevented. David's plan, the one she had mocked and dismissed, might have worked. His chaotic, unpredictable human tactics might have been exactly what they needed to fight an enemy that specialized in chaos and unpredictability. Meanwhile, on Earth, David was trying to build a new life for himself. He had taken a position, teaching tactical theory at the military academy, sharing his knowledge with the next generation of human officers. It was peaceful work, satisfying in its own way, but he couldn't escape the news reports about the war. When the reports about the defeat at New Haven reached Earth, David felt a familiar knot in his stomach. He recognized the tactical situation from the briefings he had attended. This was the battle he had tried to prepare for, the scenario where his flanking maneuver could have made all the difference. He watched the casualty reports scroll across his computer screen and felt a mixture of sadness and frustration. Good people had died because pride had been more important than cooperation. Brave soldiers from both species had paid the price for Princess Astra's refusal to consider that humans might have something valuable to contribute. But David also felt something else: vindication. Not the bitter satisfaction of being proven right, but the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you made the right choice. He had tried to help, had offered his best ideas and been rejected not because they were wrong, but because they came from someone the princess considered inferior. The war continued without him, and the news got worse with each passing week. The Zephyrian fleet, despite all their advanced technology and centuries of tactical refinement, found themselves consistently outmaneuvered by an enemy that refused to fight according to the rules of civilized warfare. Human forces, fighting separately under their own commanders, achieved some victories using the same kind of unpredictable tactics that David had always favored. But without Zephyrian technology and resources, they couldn't mount the kind of large-scale operations needed to really hurt the Void Swarm. Both species were learning the same hard lesson. Separately, they were losing. The Zephyrians had the ships and weapons, but lacked the tactical flexibility to use them effectively. The humans had the adaptive thinking, but lacked the resources to implement it on a large scale. Princess Astra learned this lesson more painfully than anyone. Each defeat taught her something new about the limitations of her perfect strategies and the value of the chaotic, unpredictable thinking she had dismissed as primitive. Late at night, alone in her chambers after another failed battle, she would sometimes think about the human captain who had tried to help her and whom she had driven away with her arrogance. She began to wonder if there might be a way to fix the mistake she had made, if it wasn't already too late for both their species. 6 months after the disaster at New Haven, Princess Astra stood before the Zephyrian High Council facing the worst military crisis in their empire's history. The Void Swarm had destroyed 17 more colonies, and traditional Zephyrian tactics had failed in every single engagement. The council members, ancient beings who had ruled the galaxy for thousands of years, looked at her with disappointment that cut deeper than any weapon. "Princess," the eldest counselor said, his voice like wind through crystal caves, "perhaps it is time to consider alternative approaches." Those words hit Princess Astra like a physical blow. Alternative approaches meant admitting that centuries of Zephyrian military doctrine were insufficient. It meant acknowledging that they needed help from beings they had always considered inferior. That night, Princess Astra made a decision that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. She would go to Earth. Not as a representative of the mighty Zephyrian Empire making demands of a lesser species, but as someone who had made terrible mistakes and needed to fix them. The journey to Earth took 3 days in her personal ship. 3 days of thinking about everything that had gone wrong, every battle lost, every life that might have been saved if she had listened to David's advice instead of dismissing it out of pride. When her ship entered Earth's atmosphere, Princess Astra saw a world that looked nothing like the primitive planet she had imagined. Cities of glass and steel stretched across continents, connected by transport networks that moved millions of people with elegant efficiency. Orbital stations sparkled like jewels around the planet, and she could see massive shipyards where humans were building vessels designed for war, but Princess Astra wasn't heading to the military installations or government buildings. Her intelligence network had found David in a place that surprised her. He wasn't commanding fleets or training elite soldiers. He was on a small agricultural colony called Haven's Rest, helping families who had fled the war zones rebuild their lives. Haven's Rest was everything the grand Zephyrian cities were not. Instead of soaring crystal towers, there were simple buildings made of wood and stone. Instead of perfectly manicured gardens, there were farms where people grew their own food. Instead of citizens who lived their entire lives following predetermined roles, there were families who had come here to start fresh. Princess Astra's ship landed in a field just outside the main settlement. She had come alone, without guards or advisors, wearing simple clothing instead of her royal armor. For the first time in her life, she wanted to be seen as a person, not as a princess. She found David near the edge of town, teaching a group of children how to grow vegetables in the colony's greenhouse. He looked different than she remembered. The rigid military bearing was gone, replaced by something more relaxed but somehow stronger. He wore farmer's clothes instead of a uniform, and his hands were dirty from working in the soil. When he saw her approaching, David's expression didn't change. He finished showing the children how to properly water the seedlings, then walked over to meet her. The kids watched curiously as their teacher talked to the tall, blue-skinned alien woman who had appeared in their town. "Your Highness," David said quietly. There was no anger in his voice, but no warmth either. Just careful politeness. "Captain Rodriguez," Princess Astra replied, then caught herself. "I'm sorry, David. I know you're not a captain anymore." They stood in awkward silence for a moment, surrounded by the sounds of a peaceful farming community. Children laughing, adults working in gardens, the distant hum of machinery helping to build new homes. It was so different from the sterile perfection of Zephyrian ships or the disciplined chaos of military bases. "I was wrong," Princess Astra said suddenly, and the words felt strange in her mouth. She had never admitted being wrong about anything important before. "About you, about humans, about everything." David studied her face carefully. "What changed your mind?" Princess Astra thought about the battles they had lost, the ships destroyed, the lives cut short because she had been too proud to listen to good advice. "My people are dying because I couldn't see past my own arrogance. Your tactics, the ones I called primitive, were exactly what we needed. I just couldn't admit that someone I considered inferior might know something I didn't. And now?" David asked. "Now I know that intelligence and wisdom aren't the same thing," Princess Astra said. "My people have incredible technology and vast knowledge, but we've forgotten how to adapt, how to think differently when old methods don't work. You tried to teach us that, and I threw it away because of pride." David was quiet for a long time, watching the children tend their plants in the greenhouse. "A lot of people have died since I left," he said finally. "Yes," Princess Astra said, "and more will die if I can't convince you to help us. Not as a subordinate or an advisor, but as a partner, as an equal." That last word seemed to hang in the air between them. Equal. It was something Princess Astra had never thought she would say to a human, but she realized it was the only way forward. David looked at her for a long moment, seeing not the arrogant princess who had dismissed his ideas, but someone who had learned hard lessons about humility and respect. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "Come back," Princess Astra said. "Help us develop new tactics that combine your adaptability with our technology. Not as a human serving under Zephyrian command, but as a joint operation where both species contribute equally." "And you think the High Council will accept that?" David asked. "The High Council is desperate," Princess Astra replied honestly. "They'll accept anything that might work. The question is whether you can forgive me for what I did to you." David thought about the months of humiliation, the dismissal of his ideas, the way she had treated him like a barely civilized animal. But he also thought about the children he was teaching, the families trying to rebuild their lives, and the thousands more who would suffer if the war continued. "I don't need to forgive you," David said finally. "I need to know that you've learned from what happened, that you understand why respect matters." "I understand," Princess Astra said. "I understand that true strength doesn't come from making others feel small. It comes from recognizing everyone's value and finding ways to work together." 3 weeks later, David found himself back on a Zephyrian ship. But this time, everything was different. Instead of being assigned to a minor liaison role, he was co-commanding a joint task force with Princess Astra. Human and Zephyrian officers worked side by side, sharing ideas and developing new strategies that neither species could have created alone. The new tactics were revolutionary. They combined Zephyrian technology with human unpredictability, creating battle plans that could adapt in real time to whatever the Void Swarm threw at them. Small human fighters worked alongside massive Zephyrian battleships, each covering the weaknesses of the other. When they finally faced the Void Swarm again, the results were everything David had hoped for and more. The enemy ships, so effective against rigid formations, found themselves constantly confused by tactics that changed faster than they could adapt. Human fighters struck from impossible angles, while Zephyrian ships provided overwhelming firepower support. For the first time since the war began, the Void Swarm retreated in defeat. But the real victory wasn't military. It was the sight of human and Zephyrian officers celebrating together, sharing ideas and stories, treating each other as equals rather than superior and inferior species. Princess Astra watched David coordinate with her tactical officers, his ideas flowing freely in an environment where they were valued rather than dismissed. She realized that she had learned something more valuable than any military strategy. She had learned that respect, once lost, could be rebuilt through humility and genuine change. The war would continue, but now both species faced it together, stronger for having learned that true alliance required more than just military cooperation. It required recognizing the worth in everyone, regardless of where they came from or what they looked like. And in that recognition, they found something more powerful than any weapon: hope.